This day in sports history. A proud member of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sports. Learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. It's July 8th, and on this day in 1889, it was the last bare-knuckle fight for a championship title, and there actually was a belt involved. So in my research for this one, I found a lot of stories about this fight, but also found a lot of misnomers. Now, one of the things that I saw was that this was a sanctioned fight. There was no sanctioning body, really, at the time. Champions could be decreed by just about anybody, even a promoter. Boxing was illegal in all 38 states at this point, and in just about every country in the world. So any boxing done had to be done with little promotion so that the fighters and even the crowd that had gathered to watch it would not be arrested by the local constabulary. And another thing I found in my research that turned out to be erroneous was the idea that the rounds were precisely 1 minute long. At this point in boxing history, a round ended when one of the fighters actually went down. So in this fight, the first round lasted about 5 seconds. Later in the fight, there was a round that lasted about 15 minutes. And while this is bare knuckle, the fighters could also wrestle, but you just couldn't grab below the waist. You couldn't hit a fighter when they were down, and there was no biting or kicking. The modern boxing rules came about from the Queensberry rules that were introduced in 1867, so about 20 years before this fight. But many fighters considered the wearing of gloves, which were dictated by the Queensberry rules, to be unmanly, and they shunned them, staying with the so-called London rules, which this fight seems to be fought under. So again, this fight is John L. Sullivan, the recognized champ of the world, and Jake Kilrain, whose real last name was Killian, but he fought under the name Kilrain. The fight came about because of hubris on the part of Sullivan and another man, a newspaper publisher named Richard Kyle Fox. Now, Fox was an Irish immigrant who had managed to save a few $100s once he landed in the States, and he bought a paper named the National Police Gazette. By the account I read, Fox was the man who came up with the idea of a specialized sports writer. He saw sports as a way to make his publication unique, and he sent his news reporters out to write stories about boxing matches and whatever other sports they could find. Fox was also a promoter of the unusual. He awarded cups and medals to winners of competitions, such as the fastest barber, the bartender who could build a pousse cafe with the most layers, or the strongest man in a city. He was like the Guinness Book of World Records guy before Guinness started tracking weird feats. So enough about who Fox was, and let's move on to the origins of this particular fight. So after a day of Sullivan taking on all challengers who accepted his offer of possibly winning $50 if they could last just 4 rounds with him, and then dispatching them all, he took his $50 to a local pub and started drinking and entertaining the crowd. Well, one of the men in the pub that night was Fox, who requested a friend of Sullivan to tell him that he wanted to talk to him. Sullivan said very loudly he had no interest in talking to Fox. Now slighted, Fox immediately disliked Sullivan and vowed to find someone who could beat him. Now this is 1881, 8 years before the fight we are working our way towards. It took that long for Fox to find Kilrain, get him trained, arrange some fights to make his name, and build him into a contender for Sullivan. Kilrain took on all challengers and he beat them. Fox put up $5,000 and he challenged Sullivan to put up a $5,000 bet to fight his man. Sullivan ignored it. So in true promoter fashion, Fox made his own championship belt and decreed Kilrain as the champion. Kilrain toured Europe and beat every fighter he faced, and then he returned to the U.S. as the claimant to the World Championship. Sullivan continued to ignore the invitation to fight Kilrain, and he actually did a tour of Europe himself, returning in April of 1888. A little later that year, Sullivan was actually beaten, not by Kilrain, but by a fighter whose name that I just couldn't find. But the beating that he took in that fight put him in bed for 4 months recuperating. His heavy drinking had taken a toll on his liver, and he also came down with typhoid during that time as well. Fox printed numerous stories during this period, calling out Sullivan and wondering aloud if he would ever be able to fight again. 1 month after emerging from what many thought would be his deathbed, Sullivan finally accepted the challenge from Fox to face his man Kilrain. But Sullivan went back to drinking heavily, and he ballooned up to 240 pounds. And many wondered how he could possibly get ready for a fight against anybody. But he did. Sullivan hired a personal trainer, a wrestler by the name of William Muldoon, to whip him back into shape. To many, it seemed like a miracle, but he was able to get Sullivan down to a trim 205 before the bout. Word got out that the fight was going to be held in Louisiana, somewhere outside of New Orleans. Again, boxing was illegal in the state and all other states, so the exact location was kept top secret. Now, you've heard of midnight trains, right? Gladys Knight sang about the midnight train to Georgia. Well, this was a midnight train to parts unknown. Just before the clock struck midnight on July 7th in New Orleans, a train pulled into the station. Now, those with the special tickets boarded this train, filling it to capacity, and they set off. 5 hours later, the train finally came to a stop in a lumber camp a little more than 100 miles north of the Crescent City in a town called Richburg, Mississippi. There was a wooden ring set up with ropes around it on a 30,000-acre plantation. The spectators got off the train and lined all sides of the ring 20 to 30 deep. The ring was set in a little depression surrounded by small hillsides that provided a rugged stadium setup. It was a hot Mississippi day. By the time the folks got off the train, it was in the 90s. It took another 5 hours for the fighters to arrive, and by that point, the temp was just north of 100. At 10:10 a.m., with the legendary Bat Masterson sitting ringside to act as clock keeper, the referee brought the fighters to their marks in the center of the ring, and he started the bout. Kilrain immediately grabbed Sullivan and threw him to the mat. It took all of 5 seconds, but that was the end of round 1. There were 30 seconds between each round, and both fighters had to exit their corner and stand on their mark to begin the next round. If a boxer could not get to his mark, the fight was over. The fight settled into a little bit of a routine until the 4th round. Kilrain was keeping his distance, so much so that the time dragged on. Sullivan got frustrated, and he yelled at Kilrain, "Why don't you fight? You're the champion. Champion of what?" Kilrain did not get angered by the goading, and he continued his strategy to try to tire out the bigger Sullivan. The 4th round lasted 15 and a half minutes. Kilrain did draw first blood in the 7th round with a shot to Sullivan's ear. Money changed hands amongst the ringside folks who had taken action on first blood. The heat began to take a bit of a toll, though, on both fighters, but you wouldn't know that by looking at Sullivan. He refused to sit between rounds, shouting, "Why should I sit? I'll just have to get right back up again." And again, with only 30 seconds between rounds, he had a point. The fight drug on. The 10th, the 20th, the 50th round, into the 60th, the 70th. And again, remember, a round didn't end until someone went down. Finally, in the 75th round, under the blistering Mississippi sun, Kilrain's head was lolling back and forth. It flopped so badly that some thought that his neck was actually broken. He had trouble holding his arms up. He had huge red welts on his back and torso. He had trouble standing on his feet. A ringside doctor had a word with one of Kilrain's cornermen and told him that his man would die if he stepped back into the middle of the ring. At the start of the 76th round, Kilrain wobbled to his feet, took a few uncertain steps to take his mark. His corner tossed in the sponge to end the fight after 75 rounds. The belt that Fox had made with his likeness on it for Kilrain was handed over to Sullivan, and he was once again recognized as the bare-knuckle champion, the last one ever to be recognized as such. After 170 years of bare-knuckle pugilism on tiny little stages all around the world, the era of ungloved fighters was over. After this fight, the Queensberry rules would be implemented for all fights, which mandated the wearing of gloves, and rounds were timed at 3 minutes. Interesting thing, though, you would have thought that adding gloves would have made boxing safer, but more boxers actually died after the introduction of gloves. The reason? Well, if you've ever hit anybody in the face with your fist, you know it hurts your hand, so body blows to softer places on the body were the norm in bare-knuckle bouts. Now, with protected hands, boxers started taking more shots at their opponent's head. So, That's the story of the last bare-knuckle brawl to crown a champion in world history. And the majority of this information for this story came from Bert Sugar's wonderful book on boxing titled The Great Fights. It is an invaluable resource for any boxing fan. Now, did anything else happen on this day? Yeah, but since I went way long on the Sullivan-Kilrain fight, I'm going to nuggetize these next few. In 2010, this was the night that everybody tuned into ESPN and watched LeBron James announce that he was taking his talents to South Beach and play for the Miami Heat. After 7 seasons with Cleveland, LeBron was at the end of his contract and he was frustrated. A few folks got together and brought the idea to LeBron for an hour-long special about his announcement. Jim Gray conducted the interview. The special actually went on for 75 minutes before LeBron finally announced at 9:28 p.m. Eastern Time that he was going to Miami. Interesting fact, NBA Commissioner David Stern was not a fan of this whole announcement deal, and he actually tried to get it canceled. In 1939, future misogynist Bobby Riggs won the Wimbledon men's singles title. This was the last Wimbledon for the next 7 years due to World War II. Wimbledon resumed in 1946. In 2000, Venus Williams won her first Wimbledon and her first Grand Slam title, beating fellow American Lindsay Davenport in straight sets 6-3, 7-6. She also teamed with sister Serena to win the women's doubles title. Now, that didn't happen on this day, but it's a nice little add-on. The Williams sisters became the first sister combo to win the women's doubles title. Did you know that there used to be a AAA minor league baseball team in Cuba? Yep, they were the Havana Sugar Kings, but on this day in 1960, more than 18 months after Fidel Castro had deposed Fulgencio Batista and taken control of Cuba, the Sugar Kings announced that they were getting the heck out of town. The U.S. and Cuba still had diplomatic relations at the time, but Castro started nationalizing U.S. businesses in 1960, and the International League Commissioner decided to move the team to New Jersey. And in 2014, Germany beat Brazil 7-1 in a World Cup semifinal match. The Germans shocked the Brazilians early and often, and led 5-0 at halftime. Now, one of those goals scored in the first half was by Miroslav Klose. That was his 16th and final World Cup goal. He is the all-time leading goal scorer in World Cup history, one better than Ronaldo. Germany would go on to win the 2014 World Cup 5 days later with a 1-0 win over Argentina. Okay, and time now for today's non-sports Did You Know? Books of the Bible have been translated into all 3 Star Trek languages of Vulcan, Romulan, and Klingon. Several have also been translated into J.R.R. Tolkien's fictional language of Quenya, or the language of the High Elves. That's all for today. I'll have more tomorrow on This Day in Sports History. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.